Let's go straight to our conversation with Adam and Vitus now. Gentlemen, I'll start with you, Adam. After seeing the Auditor General's report, what reading have you made into what government's plans were at the height of COVID-19?
It appears that there was clearly the thinking that whatever funds we raise do not need to be applied for the purposes that we set out, and we can find a way of just doing other things other than what was expected. There is clearly a wanton disregard for systems and procedures, where you have as much as 75% of the funding that was solicited going to other areas than what we understood it would be going for. And it's frightening. It's frightening, the total disregard for what is right, what is ethical, for following procedures, for getting receipts, and the spending officers, in my mind, ought to be held accountable for the various breaches that have been seen in this report.
And very well. I go to you, Vitus, now. What stood out for you in this report? Hello, Vitus, can you hear me? Well, I do. Right. We can hear you. Go ahead. What stood out for you in this report?
What stood out for me? Yes, what stood out for me reading the report is the fact that it looks like we took advantage of the pandemic to get money funding for other activities, other expenditures. Because when I listed expenditures on which we incurred, I listed just about 10 from the executive summary. And only 3 of them can be said to be linked to either COVID-19 or health-related expenditures. For the rest, they were just ordinary expenditures that we normally incur. So the question is, these monies, there were monies allocated to these expenditures in the budgets of the various years. What happened to those monies? So there were earmarked funds that should have been released to the various to those funds, which wasn't done. Where are those resources? So this is how I'm seeing it.
Very well. Adam, I come back to you on these infractions. Now, government told us that COVID-19 is the reason we are where, or Ghana is where it is today, because then it didn't get the kind of money it needed to run its business. But it would appear that receiving 21 billion, almost 22 billion during the height of the pandemic is a sign that we did get money. Does this invalidate government's excuse that COVID caused all of its economic woes?
Well, yes, this is a part of the rejection of that theory. As you recall, many of us in civil society had pointed out that prior to COVID, there was already the narrative that the economy was struggling and not being managed well. The issues with our economy did not arise during COVID or subsequent to COVID. Prior to COVID, there were already indicators that people had commented, and the financial records show that the level of borrowing, even prior to COVID, was really high. The management of the economy did not seem to be on track. So it is a mystery when one wants to isolate COVID and say that this is the big issue. In any case, as the current audit has shown, the monies even received as much as 22, the bulk of it was not applied to COVID. So really, if there's going to be an attribution, then perhaps their own management of the funding, which should have dealt with the COVID issues they are claiming are a basis for the failure, again would be called into question.
Vitus, let's talk about also about the infractions and what you think they say about government's way of doing business.
Please, can you repeat that?
Well, I'm asking, what do you think these infractions say about how government does its business?
Well, they clearly show that government doesn't take the budget seriously. Government doesn't think that it has accountable to Ghanaians and also even to the donors. A lot of this money was released from donors, bringing it to a total of 21 billion Ghanaian cedis. And we don't really have much to show except for vaccine. So that is unfortunate. The government is not accountable to us, but at least it should have felt accountable to the donors, and I don't think that that's the situation. The government does not do it in the way that things are done. We have the necessary regulations, we have the Financial Administration Act and Financial Management Act, and we have other acts that if government was paying attention to the Procurement Act, if government was paying attention to them, these things would have happened. Unfortunately, the auditor-general would always wait till the end of the period and then go out to the audit when all the monies have been spent. And it becomes a problem, even recovering monies that were not properly spent. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. And that's the situation that I found us where we are today. Government cannot use COVID-19 after this report as an excuse for the economic crisis we found ourselves in.
Vitus, what could the consequences be? One, with those who gave us the money, and two, with the Ghanaian people themselves. I mean, are there any consequences here at all?
Well,
Vitus, that's for you.
Yes, so the auditor-general report, they are asking some of the chief directors. Oh, sorry.
Hello, Vitus, I can hear you. But I think we've lost.
So I'm saying that the auditor-general has instructed some of these people to steal this money. But that's where that the money have not been properly spent. But where the money have been spent on what was meant to do, if there are inflation, that one, there's not much to be done. Of course, if the government itself was not directly involved, they could talk about sanctions on the relevant officers. But if this is presided over by the government, and so we don't expect much to happen. Because if you talk about prosecution, it is the Attorney General who is the government person to carry out the prosecution. And once the government doesn't support it, it's not going to happen.
I see. Adam, who are those you think should be held accountable based on what you have seen in this report?
Well, and maybe let me take a little bite on your previous question and say, look, at the moment, we are aware that the IMF country team in the negotiations have asked for a pre-audit prior to the approval of the funding to be released. So reports like this by the AGs stands to be factored into that pre-audit because they want to understand how government is managing resources that have been mobilized in the past. So it will have a telling effect on the nature of the negotiations and what the IMF may be demanding from the government. Again, if we're able to do good public education on this, citizens also will be mindful about who was in the chair, who has been involved in this tragedy, so to speak, because obviously some people lost their lives in the course of the COVID pandemic. That would have implications. Now, your question is who should be held accountable? I think that it starts right from the top. The minister, those who did the estimation that we needed to raise as much as 22 billion, and how they set about to keep track. We have a system in place. I gather from the report that only as little as 3% went through gift mix. And there are all the other public financial management systems in place that appear not to have been followed. So right from the minister down to the direct spending officers, those who were engaged in procuring services but did not make sure that the processes for procurement and, as it were, retirement of whatever services were followed through to the letter. In my mind, an investigation ought to find out who along that chain was culpable and hold them culpable. If there are service providers who have not provided the service or the goods to date, for example, is it $81 million worth of vaccines not delivered, we should be chasing them to have monies returned, and we should blacklist some of these service providers who clearly were either not competent or didn't have the capacity, and making sure that they don't stay within our list of service providers to be considered for subsequent such procurement engagement. So yes, I think that there cannot be any ambiguity because there are specific persons who release the fundings who can be held culpable.
The most critical question then will be, will this ever happen? We've seen this before. The Auditor General comes with a report and very little is done afterwards, knowing very well that, the Auditor General really cannot bite. It has barked, but it cannot bite. What would it take now to make sure that we get our monies from those who have taken them from the Ghanaian people, and then also, if need be, to be prosecuted, they are prosecuted to serve as an example to others?
Truth be told, I mean, it is not the case that the Auditor General can only back but not backed. I think that's why there was a hue and cry by civil society when Mr. Daniel Domlavo was compelled, was forcefully, exited from the role he was playing, especially because he made sure that the surcharging had started. Civil society went to court, the occupied Ghanaians and whatnot. They made sure that the law had been given life. I think that, and I think recently, either Occupied Ghana or CDD had talked about going back to court to ensure that the Auditor General does his biting. I think that it's a time where we should be able to say that, look, it is about time we go back to court and make sure that we don't have an Auditor General who in one sense is causing a loss to the state by not performing his functions as effectively and as comprehensively as is required by the law that set up that office. So there is something that we ought to be doing, and I think that the narrative and discussion ought to tend towards that and ensure that our Auditor General doesn't think that he's just there to write wonderful reports. We are happy about that, but we know that we have a gap. We have a serious gap when it comes to enforcement, and that's where we want to see Mr. Johnson Nketia performing at this time. Yeah.
Vitus, take us home on this one. Do you think that will happen in this administration at least? Well, I think we lost Vitus there. But Adam, if you could just take that question quickly for me, and then we wrap up on the show today.
Well, in this government, there seems to be a distinct lack of commitment to delivering on the anti-corruption fight. And it's sad. It's sad because the euphoria with which, in 2015, 2016, they spoke about good governance and people were excited and we thought that this is going to bring a change. It's just so disappointing. So whereas I would be delighted to see that the Auditor General does something, the signs are on the wall that perhaps nothing is going to change, and we will have to look forward to maybe looking at the new political campaign and how we think through who we put into government next to make sure we get some traction in this space.
But is there something that citizens could do to make sure that, people who have taken monies wrongfully return them?
Well, I think that citizens also need to be up and making a hue and cry about this report. One of the things that I'd hoped would be that the report had been a little more distinct as to who the spending officers are, a bit of name and shame. And I think that we should be demanding that the report needs to go a little further to let us know who, in what capacity, has failed us this way. We also need to be demanding for the prosecution of persons who've allowed resources to go away without the necessary accountability being done. So we should not be docile and complacent, because at the end of the day, when there's a gap, then you start getting the haircuts. When monies are misspent and things are not going well, then you are compelled to fall onto people's hard-earned reserves and savings in a way that doesn't make sense to all of us. So let's not think that in the medium to long term, just stay in your own corner and do what makes you comfortable at the end of the month. We all need to be standing up and speaking out on these issues and demanding that government follows through in finding people culpable, such that the example is set. Otherwise, there's no deterrent for people to stopping this kind of impunity.
Very well. And I'm afraid we'll have to end our conversation here. We'll blame our very short chat on network problems. But I do appreciate your time with us here on The Square.
And thank you, too.